So today we're going to finish up Section 2, and I was able to get completely through Section 3 in third hour, so we'll see if we can do that as well. We need to pick back up with Yamamoto, and that relates to Pearl Harbor. On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attacked U.S. possessions throughout the Pacific, including the Aleutian Islands, Guam, Philippines, Midway, Wake Island, etc. Yamamoto is the mastermind of this attack, and specifically the attack on Pearl Harbor. He will be the primary naval leader for Japan until he is shot down flying to a meeting on the basis of some good intelligence that we had. Okay, genocide. What is the definition of genocide?
Elimination of a specific group of people.
It is the targeted cleansing of a specific race of people. Not necessarily a specific group, but a specific race. Genocide is a part of the Holocaust, but the Holocaust in and of itself is not genocide. The Holocaust is bigger than genocide. The Holocaust included targeting certain other small groups of people on a religious basis, such as the Jehovah's Witnesses, or targeting them based on personal conduct, political prisoners, Soviet POWs. The Gypsies or Roma were targeted, homosexuals, and then, of course, the Jews. Even Catholic priests are targeted. Hitler also went after the mentally unstable, the mentally ill, the physically and mentally handicapped. Anybody who wasn't part of his ideal, he targeted. So genocide is part of the Holocaust, but it is not all-encompassing. So I want to make that distinction very clear. Okay. Hitler, after subduing France, his next target is what? Britain. Obviously, he wants to sweep up in the Western Europe. So his plan to invade Britain is called Operation Sea Lion. And in order to enact Operation Sea Lion, Hitler's going to need air superiority. He's going to have to control the air over Britain. So he launches a campaign known as the Blitz, or the Battle of Britain. The Battle of Britain mostly involves the air combat that took place over the Channel and Britain itself between British fighter pilots and the German fighters and bombers. There are a couple of tactical errors that Hitler makes. At a certain point in the war, he stopped manufacturing long-range fighters and only worked on long-range bombers. Well, bombers are slow aircraft. They need to be in order to bomb with any precision, and because they carry so much payload. And so that makes them kind of easy targets, relatively. Hitler also was unaware that the British had installed a new system along their coastline. They called it a picket system. We know it today as radar. The British could see them coming. They had warning. Eventually, the Germans are so unable to maintain air superiority that they turn to only bombing at night, and they begin to bomb population centers, not just trying to target military airfields and plants and stuff. They bomb London, they bomb York, they bomb Portsmouth, they bomb British cities and civilians. And part of the reason that the Germans were reluctant to do that is because they understood the concept of an eye for an eye.
Not the first time they actually bombed a British city on, like they accidentally did it because it was.
That's possible. But it became the thing to do. Because eventually it becomes clear that they're not going to gain air superiority, and a lot of that has to do with the Lend-Lease Act. The British were losing a lot of pilots and planes. A plane is relatively easier to replace than a pilot is. That requires a very certain set of skills and a lot of training. And the Lend-Lease Act was allowing them to replenish their planes, and it's not very long before Americans were going over and volunteering and joining the RAF, the Royal Air Force, and helping to fight as well. So they turned to a bombing campaign, and the idea here is to just bomb the British into submission, to completely demoralize their people and just make them despair and choose to give up and seek peace. Never worked. It actually made them madder that they were bombing the cities where women and children lived. Okay. So Hitler has to abandon Operation Sea Lion over time. And he knows that to really win the war, to dominate, he's going to have more resources, because he's got an army and a military force that relies on a lot of fuel. Panzers suck down a lot of oil. Bombers and fighters suck down a lot of oil. U-boats and dreadnoughts suck down a lot of oil. Hitler needs oil. He had gone to North Africa in support of the Italians and thought he could get his oil there. But the U.S. invasion of North Africa in what's known as Operation Torch kind of puts an end to that. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel is defeated, comes home, and getting oil out of the Middle East is no longer an option for the Nazis. So he's going to have to go east and southeast to the Stans and southern Soviet Union, which means that he's going to have to double-cross Stalin. So Operation Barbarossa is the German invasion of the Soviet Union. Hitler wants it to be quick. Get in, subdue them, be done. He doesn't want a Napoleon situation on his hands. That's all right, because Hitler has the blitzkrieg. Napoleon had no such thing, right? He can get in, wipe them out, no problem. The Soviets follow the same tactics that the Russians had when Napoleon invaded. They didn't engage Hitler. They kept pulling back, staying out of his way. They didn't give him a fight. So they're getting huge gains. And at a certain point in mechanized warfare, your gains can outpace the ability of your supply lines to keep up with you, right? Especially if you're not able to do any living off the land. And what do we know the Soviets were doing? They were scorching that earth. That's right. So Hitler gets to Leningrad. And here, the Soviets put up resistance. Hitler ends up in siege warfare. This is simply outlasting your opponent. This is the longest, bloodiest siege of the war. Second to it is the siege of Stalingrad, an industrial city in northwest Soviet Union. Leningrad is the new Soviet name for what city that we're well acquainted with? St. Petersburg. Okay. These are very, very costly sieges for Hitler. The Soviets do not collapse as he had expected them to, and he will not accept it. Winter sets in. More supplies are needed. The Soviets finally counterattack. They end up encircling large chunks of the German army. Hitler issues the order, no surrender. None. When a German field marshal does surrender with his army, because he knows they'll be slaughtered if they don't, they're starving, because the Luftwaffe had assured Hitler that they could supply this encircled army by air. The Luftwaffe didn't have enough planes or fuel to keep up the 24/7 constant. A plane would have had to have been taking off and landing about every 20 to 30 seconds and getting unloaded. It's too cold. The engines were freezing in flight. they could not supply the army with what it needed to keep going. So general surrenders, and Hitler disavows it. Didn't even exist. No surrender. Very few soldiers from that army ever returned to Germany. The Germans had been particularly brutal during their invasion of the Soviet Union. They would burn entire villages. They had not been at all kind to Soviet POWs, because remember, who is a Nazi's biggest enemy? A communist. They are blood enemies almost. Okay? Soviet POWs were often slaughtered on site. Those who were captured weren't sent to military POW camps, they were sent to concentration camps. And many of them were worked to death alongside the Jews. So then when the Germans end up falling into Soviet hands, their fate is oftentimes equally horrendous. Needless to say, Operation Barbarossa, not a roaring success for Hitler. But at the same time, it wasn't a roaring success for the Soviets. As soon as the Nazis invade the Soviet Union, that brings Stalin in on the side of the Allies. And we have the creation of the big three: Stalin, Churchill, Roosevelt. The big three will meet at Casablanca to plan the opening of another front in the European War. This follows the Allied invasion of North Africa, the British and American invasion of North Africa, because in order to meet there, they would have to have captured it. Right? At this meeting, Stalin is pushing very hard for open a second front. He wants this very much because right now, other than the bombing of Britain, Hitler's got nobody to pay any attention to but Stalin and the Soviets. Everything the Germans have is going there. And Stalin's like, whoa, we need some help. The Lend-Lease Act is extended to the Soviets. We're sending them supplies, supporting them as much as we can. But Stalin's like, you got to take some of the pressure off. Open another front. And the Allies are like, well, the best we can do right now is invade Italy. So we invade Sicily, we jump, and we invade Italy. And Hitler's like, Stalin goes, that's not enough. I need a big second front. When are you going to invade France? And Churchill and FDR say, we're not ready yet. We're not ready. Remember, the U.S. had, for all intents and purposes, not gotten into the war until 1942, right? We had a very tiny standing army. Our equipment was outdated. So by 1943, when they're planning this, we're just a year and a half into it. We're trying to get the size of our army ramped up. We've got some troops now who've been in battle in North Africa, a few who've been in Sicily and Italy. Not much experience going on here. And this is a very different war than World War I. Any invasion of France is going to be an amphibious invasion. Amphibious means from water to land. That's a tough invasion. They point out, we don't have a way to get our troops from water to land. They had learned from the disastrous British invasion of Turkey, or the Ottoman Empire, at Gallipoli, that how you get your troops off of the water onto the land is critically important. A landing craft to do that in any sizable numbers of troops had not yet been invented. And they said, once we get one that works, we have to be able to make enough of them to make this happen. We got to get troops and supplies and materials massed. That doesn't happen overnight, especially when we're sending all we can to you right now. Stalin is not happy. He pushes for this invasion. He wants it as soon as possible. February or March of 1944. When it comes down to it, it's going to happen on June 6th, 1944. And it is what we know as D-Day. Now, any amphibious invasion is known as D-Day. It stands for Disembarkation Day. When you get onto a ship, it's called embarking. Getting off of a ship is disembarking. embarking. So we have a D-Day in Normandy. We had a D-Day in Sicily, and D-Days in Italy, and D-Days on all of the Pacific islands that we attacked. But because this is the largest amphibious invasion ever mounted, it's the one we know as D-Day. You say D-Day, this is the one you're talking about. Okay? Now, a little backstory. Beginning with our victory in North Africa with Operation Torch. Who is the preeminent, most recognized, most militarily in battle successful U.S. general? Patton. Okay. Eisenhower gets some pretty good command experience going on there, but he's not a battle general. Patton is. Who's Patton's British counterpart? Anybody know? Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. Montgomery and Patton both have tremendous egos, and they butt heads. They compete for who can capture the objective first, who can do it fastest, who can do it best, who gets the most publicity. Well, Patton's pretty successful in North Africa, very successful in Sicily, has some success in Italy. And then Patton gets in his own way. He was popular with his troops. But while he was at a field hospital visiting some troops, he meets this soldier, who is suffering from battle fatigue, from shell shock, and he slaps him. Says, "You're not sick. Look at these actually wounded men. Shape up." There are reporters there who report this. And Patton gets slapped down. He has to apologize publicly. He does. And he's pulled back to England to be part of the planning for the inevitable invasion. While he's there, he's speaking to a ladies' group, a ladies' tea, war relief effort group. And he's giving a speech, and he makes a remark along the lines of, and after we take out those Nazis, we're going on east and we're taking out the commies. By this time, the commies are our allies. Open mouth, insert, combat boot. Right? So Patton is in some deep doo. He is told that he will not be commanding troops in the invasion at Normandy. But he plays a huge part in the invasion in Normandy, and here's how. The Germans respected no military commander from the Allies more than Patton. They read about him, they studied him. Rommel had read about Patton, Patton had read about Rommel. I mean, they were afraid of him. Okay? They were sure that if the Allies were seriously invading, they would put their invading army under Patton's command. No question about it. And the Germans look at the map of Northwest Europe and they say, well, here's England, and here's the closest spot in France to England, a place called Pas-de-Calais. That's where the invasion will take place. It'll be easiest. Ships can ferry back and forth. Get the troops there. So this is where all of the German planning is oriented. Patton's going to command. It's going to happen at the Pas-de-Calais. Since his defeat in North Africa, Field Marshal Rommel, the German panzer commander, has been put in command of the western defenses. He's in charge of defending France from invasion. He is also pretty convinced Pas-de-Calais. And above all, Hitler, Pas-de-Calais. And by this time, Hitler has made himself the supreme military commander for the Germans. The man who had risen to the extreme rank of corporal in the German army during World War I is now commanding with his extensive military and strategic experience. Nobody moves an army without Hitler's approval. Okay? All of these facts are important. The Allies have pretty good intelligence on the Nazis. And they know how much the Germans respect Patton. So they take Patton and they make him commander of a fictional army group in northeast England. Okay? They route empty trains there as though they're delivering supplies. They send requisitions and radio transmissions to that army group, and that army group generates tons of requisitions and stuff. They create inflatable tanks. They put up tent cities where the troops are being massed. They bring ships up there for, this fictional army. And they station Patton there so that he is seen around, he's driven around, he's photographed. He is publicly visible. The Germans and their spies in England are just sucking all this up. Okay? Now, when it comes to selecting an invasion date, there's a few things that need to be locked together. The beaches at Normandy had been selected as the place to go. But they are long, shallow beaches. So you're going to need the tide to be high at landing time so that the landing craft can get the shortest distance between the beaches and the cliffs that are behind them, or the hills in some of the spots on Normandy. Okay? At the same time, do you want to land in broad daylight? No, you want to land as dark as possible, which means 2 or 3 days when there's no moon every 28 months. So you have to find the time where the tide is highest, right before the dawn, on the days when there's no moon. Okay? This is not just, tomorrow looks good, let's go. This takes serious planning. The 5th of June is supposed to be it. The North Atlantic is an ugly place. The English Channel can be even uglier. And there is a nasty storm front coming through. It's lashing England with heavy driving rain. Part of the invasion goes beyond the amphibious. Part of the invasion is going to be paratroop drops behind the lines. And those folks are going to be important because they're going to capture communication centers. They're going to cut strategic telephone and telegraph lines. They're going to capture and protect bridges and road network hubs. They're going to protect some rail network hubs. Because once the troops come ashore and they establish what's known as a beachhead, they've got a good foothold, they're going to start pushing in. And they're going to need all of those things that will help the Germans defend. The Allies will need to attack. Okay? So, in driving rain and heavy fog, you can't exactly have a successful paratroop drop. But the forecasters say there's a front coming through and things are going to clear up. So they're like, all right. Well, they have these men already loaded on the craft, out there bobbing in the English Channel waiting. And they're like, they got to wait more. Eisenhower's not real happy, and he says, we go tomorrow. We got to go. So, D-Day becomes June 6th, 1944. The invasion was successful, but it was not easy. Because the winds were still strong, a lot of the gliders and a lot of the planes were blown off course, and the paratroopers didn't land exactly where they were supposed to. The Germans had flooded many of the fields, which made the landing even harder on the troops. Many of the landing craft encountered such heavy fire that they would stop and drop the troops off further out. And when they would step off the landing craft, they were in water over their heads. They had such heavy packs they couldn't swim. Many of them drowned immediately. There were machine gun emplacements all over all of the Normandy beaches, and sometimes they would just rake the troops and slaughter them as they were coming off the ships. But the thing is, we had more coming behind them. And those troops did not quit. They kept going. It's really an amazing thing to think about. How many of you have seen Saving Private Ryan? Okay. Probably the most realistic depiction of what that was like. And you have to think, this is tens of thousands of troops, okay, on 5 codenamed beaches being attacked in Normandy. Omaha Beach is the one you're familiar with, and it's not just because you live here in Omaha. Omaha is probably the most heavily defended beach of the Normandy beaches. It is the beach with the highest casualty rate. It is the last beach where a successful beachhead is actually established. At the western end of, oh yes please, at the western end of Normandy Beach, at the
Away from that diseased waffle.
Yeah, why is it so there?
because why not? It's been a week.
Exactly.
Okay. How many of you have eaten an Eggo waffle?
Yeah, look, it hasn't moved or anything.
It's been a week. It was on the floor. It's been a week.
Who has an ego in your class?
No, it
Who
was in
brings
the
egos?
hall last Thursday. Seniors were throwing them. Why would you eat something that after a week,
It's still like, no.
I will never eat another frozen waffle in my lifetime.
I think it's still.
I will.
Not just throw away. They might.
No, I want it to decay at this point.
What have I done? Why just say it like that?
You'll come back in the fall and you'll still have that waffle there.
All right. At the, I just figured it out, standing ocean, western end, thank you. At the western end of Omaha Beach is a very high set of cliffs called Pont du Hoc. On top of those cliffs, the Germans had deeply embedded, heavily reinforced concrete gun emplacements that commanded a view of where the whole armada would be bringing these troops in. It was understood that those gun emplacements needed to be taken out. Mallory, what is so engaging in the outside world? Huh? And that's why you're on your phone. So we needed to take those guns out. Through prolonged naval bombardment, the gun emplacements were still there, still intact. Yeah, I mean, lots of bombardment. You can go and visit Pont du Hoc, and you walk along, and you can go down in these craters, and they are 20, 30 feet deep. And still, today, the gun emplacements are still there, solid. So Rangers, Special Forces had trained to go in and shoot grappling hooks up and climb hand over hand up these ropes to be able to assault those gun emplacements and blow up the guns. That is an incredibly difficult thing to do, because while you are climbing hand over hand up a rope, it's hard to hold a gun and defend yourself, isn't it? You are completely vulnerable. There are guys dropping hand grenades down, firing down at you, trying to get kind of laterally and shoot at you. Tremendous casualties. The Rangers get up there. They fight their fight, and the gun emplacements are empty. Well, they're not exactly empty. There's like foam poles stuck in where the gun barrels would have been. The Germans had taken the guns out and moved them a few miles back and left the... Why bother with the telephone poles? Reconnaissance, to make it look like it, to make us waste resources and manpower trying to capture something that wasn't there. The soldiers did pursue the guns inland and captured them without incident. So that was a kind of a good thing that happened. But Omaha Beach was a very hard-fought battle, tremendous casualty rate there. Probably second, Arlington Cemetery. Has everybody been to Arlington and Washington, D.C.? Pretty somber, sobering place to go to look at all of the people who have served and died, not necessarily in the battle, but have served the United States and died. To be at the American Cemetery at Normandy Beach is awesome, and I don't mean awesome cool, it is just awesome. It kind of hollows out your chest, and for me it left me feeling very, very because without that tremendous sacrifice, and there are German and Canadian and Polish cemeteries in Normandy as well. And when you're there, you're standing on American soil. That is a little piece of America where those soldiers are buried. And it is just row after row after row of white headstones. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. Teddy Roosevelt's grandson was buried there. He didn't die at Omaha Beach. He was killed in Italy a few days later, but he wanted to be buried there with his troops. Medal of Honor, in fact. Okay. After the successful invasion of France, the Allies push on, and it's pretty much a little under a year to the end of World War II in Europe, May 8th, 1945, but we'll cover that a little tomorrow. Between D-Day and the end of war in Europe, the big three go to Yalta and meet at what's known as the Yalta Conference. And what they're discussing while they're there, Yalta's in the Crimea, what they're discussing while they're there is how should Europe look when we're done with this? And what should be done in the Pacific when we're done in Europe? And some deals were made. The Soviets agreed to get into the war in the Pacific within a certain time frame after the conclusion of war in Europe. They made the deal that the Soviets would be allowed to capture Berlin, and that we would they sort of drew the dotted line down the middle of Europe where the Soviets would capture, where the rest of the Allies would capture. At that time, and there's a lot of debate about this historically, by the time of Yalta, FDR is very ill. We know he's going to die in the spring of 45, and there are some who think that Churchill, being so anxious to just get the war done, and FDR being in kind of his weakened state, that Stalin took advantage of them and pushed them around and bullied them. We don't know for sure what exactly happened there, but it does look like there were a lot of concessions that were made for the Soviets. At the same time, when you look at the losses in World War II in terms of cost and fatalities and casualties, the Soviets exceed even the German losses. So if you're giving up that much, shouldn't you get a little something? Who knows? The other thing I want to tell you guys is in Italy, Mussolini was overthrown. He was captured by Italians who wanted to make peace with the Allies and be done with this war thing. Hitler said, no, and invaded Germany, invaded Italy, which was no longer then part of the Axis because Mussolini had been overthrown. He gets Mussolini and restores him to power in Italy and keeps the Italians under Mussolini and the German troops occupying Italy fighting all the way to keep the Allies occupied in Italy. So know that. At the end of the war in Italy, Mussolini is captured along with his mistress. They are lynched. They are drugged naked through the streets. People throw rotten food and vegetables. They kick them. The Italians were not appreciative of Mussolini at the end. And what happened to him may have played into Hitler's decision at the end of the war he married Eva Braun, his longtime mistress, and to commit suicide together with her in the bunker so that he wouldn't be captured. He left orders that their bodies be taken upstairs outside the Fuhrer bunker and burned because he did not want what happened to Mussolini happening to he and Eva Braun. Unfortunately, gasoline doesn't burn all that hot, and they didn't have a tremendous amount of it. And so when the Soviets did get there, they were pretty well able to be sure that they had Hitler's remains. Questions? The Soviets took care of anything that was left so that nothing could be held up like a martyr's relic for any Nazi hangers on afterwards. So we certainly don't have anything now. And the Soviets were pretty secretive about it. We have pretty conclusive evidence now that they found it.
Did you get that backstory from that history documentary on History Channel, the World War II thing?
I got the backstory from all of, in my